Hello, everyone. Welcome to your Wednesday edition of Portland Cocktail Week Distance Learning. Today, we are all about the brandy. Very excited for all of the folks that you see here on screen with me to do most of the talking today, because they all know a lot more about brandy than I do, and they're going to tell you all about it. So our guests today, we're going to have Eric Indrican, sommelier, ambassador for Germain-Robin. We're going to have Chris Chamberlain, who is the director of beverage development. Did I get that right, Chris?
It's close enough.
I tried. I really did.
I'll take the director title if you're going to give it to me. So why not?
Consider it yours. I have granted it to you.
Thank you.
For E&J Gallo, tasting along with Eric and Scott. I'm getting to Scott last because he's got some stuff to tell you. But tasting along with Eric and Scott are going to be Jay Harrison and Linda Garcia, two of our winners of the Gallo, the Argonaut and Germain-Robin California Brandy Rediscovering California's Native Spirit quiz. They scored incredibly well, so they are here with us today. And speaking of Argonaut, we have Scott Richardson here, who is the National Argonaut Ambassador and general bearer of good news. So, Scott, you've got some good news for us today, yes?
Yeah, thanks for having us back on, Brittany. I always appreciate the over-the-top nice introductions, and I'm really excited to have Linda and Jay joining us today. Some amazing brandy fans out there. We always love our fans, and any opportunity to taste along with them. But before we really get kicked off with tasting through some of our products and then eventually getting to some of the real juicy stuff today with Chris Chamberlain talking about cocktails, would like to share some really exciting news that we have, which is officially announcing the opening of the first ever California Brandy House located in the heart of downtown Napa. This is the first week that we've shared any sort of details behind what you can actually expect to see from this Brandy House, which is really this amplified tasting room, bottle shop, overall next level educational experience behind all things California Brandy that we have to offer. And Friday, November 6th, I believe, will be the first official day that the doors open to the public. And so we're really trying to show our commitment as much as possible to shedding more light on this category of California Brandy that we all know and love, and that we're from a wider audience, we're really just trying to rediscover its roots and show us all how exciting it is for modern day craft spirits drinkers and what this means for the future. And we just think that this Brandy House is a really fun way to do so. Due to COVID, it'll only be open to outdoor tastings for the time being, but it is worth noting that we have a really spacious and beautiful brand new redwood patio right on First Street in downtown Napa to offer those outdoor tastings right off the bat. And aside from offering brandy flights of Argonaut and Germain-Robin, through this Brandy House experience, you'll also have a chance to taste different components of some of our amazing blends, like the individual brandy legs of a certain distillate out of a copper pot still versus a column still. If you tuned into our first seminar about California Brandy and kind of the 101 behind it and understanding how we make this incredible spirit in many different ways, you get to see a lot of those individual components from different distillates, from different types of grapes. So you have a chance to taste some of those and then kind of wrap it into why that helps amplify our final blends that are so complex, and that we'll talk a little bit more about today when we taste them. So there's a really nice amplified tasting experience through that. And then you'll also continue to learn more about the history and processes behind our brandies. And of course, we'll offer an on-site bottle shop with bottle engraving service, as well as some really cool bespoke merchandise from some local craftspeople and whatnot. So overall, it's going to be a really fun experience as it continues to develop. But even if it's just outside on our new patio, it'll still be a fun way to introduce that to the public. So, yeah.
Well, that is exciting news. I also have a California Brandy House fun fact. Everybody you see on the screen, you can just forward our mail there because we live there now. So we hopefully will be at our new residence when you come to visit. So thank you so much, Scott. And it's actually also now your turn to lead us through a tasting of all of the delicious Argonaut products that were sent to our 25 big winners.
Of course. I'm excited to do so. And we can stop for a moment on the first or the second slide, I think. We did have a slide about the California Brandy House there, just kind of giving you a little snapshot of some of those details I was mentioning. But I pretty much covered all those features that you can kind of look forward to, and continue to kind of follow us on our social channels, and just stay tuned with Argonaut and Germain-Robin to hear more about it as it develops. But let's dive into some tastings. So we're going to start with Argonaut, and then Eric will take over and give us a tasting of a couple of the expressions of Germain-Robin before Chris takes it away with some really cool cocktail knowledge and really the history of Brandy cocktails. So first up, though, is Saloon Strength. This beautiful bottle right here. If you did tune in to our first seminar, I mean, you've heard all about our blending grids that we put on the back of every bottle of Argonaut. So we're super transparent about how we create these blends. And when we're tasting Saloon Strength, being the first California brandy of the day, I do like to just start out and make sure we spend a little extra time on the nose here, because there's something that is just extra special about well-made California brandies on the nose. The aromatics just offer something that a lot of other finely crafted brown spirits don't quite offer. And a lot of that comes through in the really fresh fruit and floral notes, and sometimes even slightly herbaceous notes too. And that's all separate from what you get from the maturation and from the oak, right? But just talking about those grapes and what the fresh grapes bring to the table after the distillation, and then after they're blended and mellowed. On here, you're really going to get some nice fresh cut red apples, like dipped in caramel right off the nose. That's kind of what I get. I know the power of saying some things right off the bat can influence what some of you are getting. Linda, JA, what are you guys getting off the nose?
I definitely thought like red apple, like I just want to bite into it. Really ripe fruit, like stone fruit as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's so super, like also like a bit floral.
Yeah, absolutely.
You guys both definitely stole all my thunder, because I literally have written down here in notes apple caramel and stone fruit.
Oh, I love that. We did not plan this at all.
But I also find it very grape forward in a way, which is kind of like an Oda thing to say, because it's a grape distillate. But compared to some of these others that we'll get into later, I find the grapes to come more to the forefront.
Yep. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because as we taste through these expressions, you'll notice that there is a reoccurring theme of that grape forward, that fresh fruit forward aspect to it. Even though they have a lot of age on them, we really like using ex-bourbon barrels, and that neutrality of that oak really helps prevent the brandies from becoming over oaked, and letting those fruit forward, those grape characteristics really shine, even after so many years aged in barrel. So you'll kind of see that as we go throughout the lineup here. But I kind of get this really nice spiced honey right on the entrance on the palate. And then it just kind of goes out into a lot of those stone fruit notes on the palate. Like you were mentioning, the apples, the pears come through, like caramelized spiced pear. Black raisin is something that kind of comes out to me, but really just a great one to start with, because it's a well-rounded experience of a lot of different things you can learn to appreciate, both off the nose and on the palate, from a well-made California brandy. So let's dive into Speculator next. Let's give this one a nose. So for those others of you watching right now, yeah, we're looking at Speculator. What's interesting about this, and you can kind of keep the screen a little bit larger on this blending grid. Now you'll start to see a little bit of influence, more influence now from one of the legs of brandy blended in here, coming from the alembic pot stills, because you'll still see a lot of the coffee, or otherwise known as like the column still influence on this, like you saw a lot of that from Saloon Strength. But on Speculator, now we're starting to utilize our other capabilities of distillation with the alembic pot distillates. It's just going to add more nuance, more complexities to the final spirit. But the Chardonnay and the French Colombard really comes out in all its glory in this, in ways even past some of those stone fruits and into tropical fruits. I really almost get some cooked pineapple and like traces of banana and even maybe mango on this one that were maybe not quite as pronounced on the first expression we tasted. And that's something that sets Speculator apart for me. What about you guys?
I totally agree with the banana. Probably more of like a green banana, a bit of a less ripened sort of vegetal banana, and less into that like sweet banana bready flavors, but super like fresh.
I'm also getting like orange notes right off the bat. I kind of with this one, I just thought of like playing with doing a brandy Mai Tai.
Oh gosh, yes. Chris's brain is just going, yeah, okay. We'll talk a little bit more about that. You know, it's really cool you mentioned about that, Linda. If we go back to the blending grid on the screen, the last leg blended into this one is coming from that muscat. And even though it says 1% from that muscat, if you were to taste that single varietal on its own or smell it, you would notice orange blossom more than anything else. There's this orange floral characteristics that just shoot out of the glass from that, and even just blending in a slight touch of that is helping you get some of those notes that you're getting there. And so I would say that those floral characteristics are coming through a little stronger on Speculator as well, relative to probably where we started with Saloon Strength. So another really fun one. It's kind of starting to show you some other aspects of California Brandy. So let's wrap it up here with Fat Thumb. Now, right off the bat, when you look at the blending grid here, you're going to see a lot more influence coming from those alembic pot distillates with those stills. And when we start using more of those types of distillates, flavor notes aside, just talking about the texture and the weight on your palate, this is going to create a richer, kind of heavier experience of the liquid as it's kind of going across your palate and just sitting there. Most likely a longer finish will be something you'll experience with this brandy. And that's just taking from more of those alembic pot distillates and a bigger blend of that, but still getting some of those amazing qualities we get from our coffee or column distillates to get those really fresh, focused, bright fruit notes. But I think with Fat Thumb, you'll kind of start to get this much more creamy, rounded, silky experience of a lot of these flavors we've already tasted, but now probably a little bit more of that oak influence, adding some of those like holiday spices and those warming notes. So I'm curious what you guys think about this one.
Yeah, I definitely feel with this one more oakiness. I think like clove and baking spice, definitely vanilla.
Mm-hmm.
I get the orange notes pretty heavily on this one. Specifically like cuties, you know?
Oh my God,
there's a Facebook group that I'm a part of called Dad's Drinking Bourbon, and there's this recurring joke that the official drink of Dad's Drinking Bourbon is a Cuties Old Fashioned, because your wife always has cuties laying around in the fridge for you to express those orange oils. And I think that this would make like a pretty fantastic Cuties Old Fashioned.
Yep. I see a lot of cuties in California, so like that's now I'm going to think about that all the time. But that's a great. I like it though, because we can talk about apples and we can talk about oranges, but then you can get so much more focused on what type of apple or what type of orange. And here I get like red apple spiced cobbler. Like I'm starting to get more of these baked and spiced and toasted notes, whereas some of the other brandies maybe a bit more brighter, a bit more like fresh cut citrus forward. And this, it just really starts to get mellowed and kind of spicy. But still so silky at the same time, with just a longer kind of just heavier finish almost in a way, a bit more reminiscent of probably some finer cognacs we've tasted in the past, right? But I think that those fresh California fruits are still very present right on the nose and still on the palate. So really nice one to end with to round out Argonaut's profile. So hope you guys enjoyed this. Well, I think from here we can get into Germain-Robin. So Eric, take it away.
All right, Scott, thanks. So I think one of the things that's really important with Germain-Robin is that it's such an iconic brandy that comes from California, and it has such a lineage and history that when I taste it, I'm not only tasting like kind of like just a brandy on its own, I'm tasting all that, 37 years of history that has gone into this brandy. So if you want to go ahead and Nose off the 7-year. This is a brandy that's based around Colombard, and I think that like some of the legs that Scott talked about with Colombard, you really see this almost citric flavor coming through, but it's almost like a slightly cooked citric flavor to me, but there's a lot more complexity in how it plays out just because of the interaction of the wood. And what I find is that when you get this, when you nose it, I mean, I'm getting this kind of like orange marmalade or like some tea notes that come through a little bit. There's obviously a fair amount of oak here, being a minimum age of 7 years. And, you know, where Scott uses a lot of different type of oak in Argonaut, mostly used bourbon barrels. At Germain-Robin, we're exclusively cognac barrels. We're looking at Vicard air-dried oak. And where Scott has a lot of information on the back label, we do not offer that because we want this to be a secret recipe that you will never know what goes into this bottle. So that's our little secret. No, we can give you some information on it. Like I said, it's about 70% Colombard. But Jay, what do you think about the nose and aroma on the brandy?
I'm getting a lot of caramel out of this as well. A bit more of like a rounder palate. Pretty a good bit of apple notes on that as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you said the rounder palate, because I noticed one of the things that's really distinctive about Germain-Robin to me is the length and like time it spends on your palate. And I notice like sometimes I compare this a lot with cognac because I do a lot of blind tastings with Germain-Robin against cognac, because cognac's kind of our model for how we produce brandy. But you know, we're utilizing all these different grapes that they don't use in cognac, so you're able to work with all these different flavor profiles. What I get is comes in the palate, I get that wood up front a little bit, but then the fruit starts to come back at the end of it, and I get some, you know, almost like a dried apple, dried pear component in the back end, and then I get some of the you know, that orange marmalade that I talk about a lot in it. So you know, definitely some wood spices there. Linda, how do you feel about the brandy?
Yeah, I definitely get fruit notes, and the woodiness, but also maybe like some herbs in the back as well. Maybe like kind of like along like thyme.
Okay, great. Yeah, I could see that definitely being part of it. Yeah, you know, Germain-Robin, it's a product that we really like to drink neat. But I mean, Chris will talk about if you want to do some pretty amazing cocktails. It's a good place to start with that. Let's move on to the XO, and the XO is kind of this is the brandy that when Hubert first distilled it, thought it was the best distillate he'd ever seen in his life. And if you think about how brandy is produced around the world, most of it is produced from grapes that are not red. It's mostly a white grape spirit. And so experimenting with Pinot Noir really gave him a different textural sense on the palate. And it also provides a completely different flavor profile from all those other white grapes. So on the nose, I mean, to me, it's so complex to me. It's just got this really this melange of like red fruit components, kind of like raspberry, and there's a framboise note that comes out in the back note of it. But then you put that wood on it, and you're starting to get all these like baking spice. But it goes almost more into an exotic Asian spice kind of a characteristic with star anise and cardamom and sandalwood and things of that nature. And then you get kind of that really elusive character in really fine brandy. And what you really need to produce great brandy is you need time in barrel. Is this kind of rancio characteristic that's a little rare in a lot of spirits. You see it, and David Warder, our master distiller, has no idea how it develops. Hubert's convinced that it develops over time. But if you look at this is almost exclusively Pinot Noir. There's some other grapes blended into it, but it is based around Pinot Noir, and the minimum age here is going to be about 12 years of age. That's the youngest brandy in the blend. Most of the brandy here is coming from the mid to late 90s and early 2000s. So you have a brandy that's, you know, pretty much in excess of maybe 20 years old if you combine all those dates. But Linda, what do you think about the XO?
Yeah, so one thing I noticed is like the finish is very long. I get a lot of spice. But even when I first tasted it, also kind of like dark chocolate for me.
Mm-hmm.
Great pairing with that. Jay, how about yourself?
Yeah, on the front, it's definitely more oak forward than the flagship that we tasted, but you still get a lot of those like meringue undertones, similar sort of that round palette that I was talking about. I think on like the sliding scale, a bit closer to like that Leopold Gourmel style. and moving further away from like that Osbach style. I tend to think in like shapes when I'm tasting, and like I think of the Osbach as more of like sharp flavors, and the Leopold is more of like round palate flavors. And even though this has a lot more oak forwardness to it, which you could think of as like a sharpness, it definitely like mellows out toward the mid and back palate into like a nice like creamy meringue like texture.
Yeah, that actually is interesting. In the distillation process, there's a point where the distillate can kind of become bitter, and if you put that in oak, oak is tannin for the most part, and so you're getting bitterness out of the oak and barrel as well. So it's interesting that we try to avoid any sort of bitterness in the base distillate, and I'm glad you said that. You get it up front because you're tasting the oak, but you're not getting this grape bitterness that might come through tannin from the grapes. So definitely true. All right, yeah, we recommend these as neat, but I think Chris might have a little bit of a question or an argument about what you might be able to do with one or two of these brandies if you decide, so be it, to put it in a cocktail. I think it's amazing to me that when you think about why the cocktail was originally invented, it was to cover up bad tasting spirit. And so I think, fortunately for us, the spirit isn't bad tasting anymore, but I think the cocktail craze has stuck. And so I think we're a benefit from that anyways. All right.
Yeah, I think
I may not want to abuse that, by the way, Eric. I think I'd leave Germain-Robin by itself.
Fortunately, Chris is going to tell us everything about brandy cocktails, everything you can fit into a 1-ish hour stream on Facebook that you might want to know about brandy cocktails. And we're going to move into that in just a second. But before we do, I wanted to, again, say thank you to Scott and Eric. If you maybe didn't catch the masterclass somehow that has all of this really wonderful information about how both Argonaut and Germain-Robin are made, you can watch that on this actual page. Not now, when we're done with this, you can go back and watch that one. And J.A. and Linda, thank you so much for giving your insight. I know both of you are incredibly talented and incredibly smart, and so I really enjoy hearing y'all's opinions on things. But
Thank you.
speaking of opinions, we're going to cover some big opinions now with our dear friend, Chris. So, Chris, let's kick it off, bud.
Okay, thank you very much. Excited to be here, talk about brandy. However, let's level set the conversation before we get into this, right? So today's focus is on the evolution of brandy cocktails. This will not be brandy specific. It will not be brand specific. We are going to cover all of brandy and understand how we got from point A at the very beginning to kind of where we are today. Two, when we talk about the history of cocktails, many of them are shrouded in mystery. I don't want to provide any romanticized stories. I want to be as factual as possible. But facts are ever changing, so we can only share what we know today, and we have to have an understanding of that. And then lastly, when we think about who's going to watch this, we have to understand that we're going to have a vast community of not only bartenders, but spirit enthusiasts. And when you have a vast community that large, there's a lot of diversity, right? You have diversity in skill sets and knowledge. So today we don't want to get bogged down into the minutia details. We still want to make it interesting. However, we're going to just provide pretty much like a high level overview of those facts and the interesting stories that kind of move us along the way on this traditional path. So now that we've said that, I think we can get started. So on to the next slide is where we will begin. And we will credit David Wondrich for his unbelievable help in creating this evolutionary timeline. When we asked David to create this timeline for us, we felt there was a need to really understand brandy's importance and the important role that it played in the art of mixology over the past 2 centuries. When we dive deeper into this, you're going to see that David kind of broke the lineages up into two aspects. You have one, you might see 3 lines, and these cocktails are direct descendants of their predecessors. And then secondly, you're going to see a single line. These cocktails are pretty much inspired by the libations that kind of came before it, based on their bills or ingredients, but there was some inspiration there along the way. Now, I'm not David. David has his reasons for creating this list the way that it is. I'm not going to dive into the whys because we could sit here forever talking about the rabbit holes that we can create with this. However, my job here today is pretty much, let's look at it to be like the tour guide, right? I'm just going to tell the interesting stories that, we see with some of these cocktails just to kind of move our conversation forward. So as you can see here, it looks a little bit of like an eye chart, right? So what we're going to do to simplify this is that we're going to break it down into smaller sections. We're going to begin at the very bottom, and we're going to run through a couple time loops along the way, but we're going to try to work our way up to the modern classics of brandy cocktails that we know today. So with that said, we'll start at the very bottom. And before we talk about cocktails, we need to talk about the brandy itself. So brandy has a long history globally, dating back through the 1400s. And we all know as a fruit distillate, you can make brandy out of anything, right? So there are massed amounts of variations you can see out there. But we're going to hyper focus ourselves where we live, and that's here on the Western Hemisphere, right? And living in the United States, we all know one of the earliest and the first distillery that we find in the U.S. is a brandy distillery. It's Applejack. They were making Applejack, beginning in the late 1600s. I don't know the exact date off the top of my head when it was officially a distillery. However, the first distillery ever on the entire Western Hemisphere is located in Peru. And that's obviously with Peruvian Pisco. Right. So it dates back to 1684 as a first official distillery creating a product. And that product would be the unaged brandy of Pisco. So to put that kind of in context, a lot of people like to talk about rum and specifically Mount Gay that dates back to 1703. But when we think about Peruvian Pisco and that first distillery creating Pisco as a brandy, we're talking, 20 years prior to the Mount Gay facility actually being in existence. So as we begin to explore the idea of cocktails, now that we look at the spirit, David has a clear break here from unaged to aged brandy. And there's a purpose in that because Pisco cocktails are obviously much different than aged brandy cocktails, right? But aged brandy being at the heart of drink development really starts within the punch era. And that's the next slide that we're going to dive into. And obviously, I have David's punch right here. We all know that punch kind of lies at the cornerstone of the entire evolutionary chart of not only brandy cocktails, but cocktails essentially. But, brandy was a crucial part to those early punches, whether it be a base spirit or just a secondary accent ingredient. And using David's book, Punch, right, we can reference that, punch as a cocktail is extremely important. It was a beverage used as a communal beverage. It's kind of like the great unifier. I think more people need to be drinking punch today, not during a pandemic, but for the greater good. And when we look at the earliest versions of punch, I think in David's book, he dates Dr. Salmon's punch, which goes back to 1695. The recipe, just a quart of water, a pint of lime juice, 3/4 of a pound of sugar, and then 3 pints of brandy topped with nutmeg, right? It's one of the earliest renditions of punch, and we know that brandy is there at its base. You can see through his timeline that the next kind of direct lineage to punch would bring us to the milk punch. And if you haven't had the clarified milk punch, I definitely would recommend one because they are ridiculously delicious. And I love talking about the milk punch specifically because it kind of, if you put it in our context, it brings the front of the house and the back of the house together, I think, for the first time, right? We look at a beverage being created with a culinary technique, and we have to give this credit to a woman. A woman should have the credit of that first milk punch. And this is the inclusion of that hot milk and that process of kind of, releasing out those curds and clarifying out a punch. So, it's a beautiful rendition, but it's that first kind of extension from punch that we start to see, obviously using brandy as part of its base. And that's kind of at the change of the century there. Punch evolved and you start seeing many variations come into play. And David, I think I counted out 16 versions of punch within his punch book recipes. And 11 of those 16 recipes all contained brandy in some way, shape, or form. And if you want to think about brandy's importance in addition to that, even when we think about the godfather of all cocktails, Jerry Thomas, the first drink that he ever got in publication was brandy punch. Right. So let's look here at this little red dot that I have in the corner. And this goes where punch kind of brings that unaged brandy back into play. You know, Pisco tends to be 100 years late to the game over and over again. And this is the first time where, you know, obviously we see Pisco Punch being 100 years late, but still being a player in the game. And this is where unaged brandy kind of comes back. And if you haven't had a Pisco Punch, I definitely recommend one. California lineage, created in San Francisco. But again, I don't want to get into the minutiae, the details of things. We don't have much time. However, from there, you have to think that the height of popularity of punch is between like the American Revolution to the Civil War, right? And this is also the same time period we start to see brandy, eggnog, and the Tom and Jerry come into play. But you'll see that there's a dotted line here. And that's because, you know, in David's mind, he actually puts the brandy eggnog in direct lineage to the toddy and sling. I don't want to get into his thought process in that. However, I think a lot of people look at the eggnog and the Tom and Jerry as punch style cocktails just because of the service element of it. Not so much the build of it, but just for the service element. So I mentioned the toddy and sling, but in an effort to move our way forward, I'm going to sidestep a little bit and we're going to jump over to Europe real quick. So on the next slide, we're going to see two extensions off of this map, and that is brandy and bitters and the burnt brandy and bitters. The mixture of brandy and bitters kind of dates back to that late 17th century. Simple 2-ingredient mixture. You know, it was looked at for its medicinal properties, so to speak. They believed it to be a hangover cure, whether or not you added bitters to either brandy or wine. There is a book, I don't know if you've ever read Bitters, that is out there, but there's one thing I want to point out, and that's concerning the burnt brandy and bitters. Originated in London, right in that midpoint of the 1700s. It is not a US creation. However, in this book, David suggests that in the build of it, there's a possibility that we all think of the old fashioned as being a US creation. However, in that mid 1700s, the idea of taking brandy, adding heat and sugar to melt that sugar into the brandy and adding bitters to create the burnt brandy and bitters, arguably is that the first old fashioned, and was the old fashioned originally created as a European, specifically London creation, not a US creation. I don't want to get into that argument. It's an interesting thought, right? It is a warm version. You have brandy, you have sugar, and you have bitters. It's essentially an old fashioned. However, you know, I digress. We'll kind of move ourselves along. And when we think about bitters, you know, over in Europe, you know, bitters were looked at for its medicinal properties and almost like a medicinal ingredient. However, here in the US, you can kind of give credit to us of looking at bitters as more of a traditional flavoring ingredient and not just for its medicinal properties. So with that said, we'll move on to the next slide. And since we're talking about medicinal properties, that's where we'll get into the toddy and the sling, right? Before I dive too deep into it, I just want you to take note to this small little dotted line I created. And that showcases the brandy cocktail, the brandy punch. Just note where these are on the evolutionary chain because it's going to be important later. But let's talk about the toddy and sling, right? We're still in this archaic age, so to speak, of the American mixology, you know, that colonial era. The ingredients were really rough. The tools are extremely limited. I think the only tool that you could find was the toddy stick, right? Imagine a muddler that's kind of, you know, overdone and decorative. But it's usually primarily just to crush sugar, right? And a toddy and a sling fall into the broader family of what David calls kind of the pre-cocktails. And this is defined as something that's strictly spirit, sugar, and water, right? If you want to throw another namesake in there, we can kind of throw the skin into the play. I think in Ireland, they would call it a skin, not a toddy or sling. However, you know, when we talk about toddy and slings, there's a little bit of consumer confusion. Like, what's the difference between the two? So a sling would primarily use cold water, a toddy, primarily hot water. Builds essentially the same, right? However, declared to be kind of the best drink for your health, I think more doctors were prescribing specifically a brandy toddy to kind of cure your ails for, again, its medicinal value, if we want to call it that. I don't believe any cocktail is healthy for you, but there are wellness factors of the secondary ingredients that might assist in other factors. However, when we talk about the sling, let's look at the addition of medicinal ingredients, specifically herbs like mint. And when mint is added to a sling, we of course get the mint sling. And this brings us through the evolutionary chart to the left-hand side to probably my favorite cocktail of all time, and that is the mint julep. Why are we talking about the mint julep? Great question. Well, neither punch, the toddy, or sling are American creations. I will argue that the julep is the first true American drink or beverage of choice with alcohol. And I think it's funny that, the term julep is started almost as a joke. You're taking a mint sling, but if you define what is a julep was defined as a medicine that was administered with a syrup. So I think this was almost like a medicinal elixir, kind of a consumption excuse of the day of, if we call it a mint julep, it's technically medicine. So now I can drink on a regular basis, right? So interesting fact there. However, when we look at the mint julep, it originated in Virginia in and around 1770. The first spirits being used within a julep were primarily both rum and brandy. But we can see here that David kind of really showcases the brandy julep as a 1790, right? So what was happening in 1790 is, as the julep's popularity began to spread throughout the Northeast, up to Massachusetts, down to Georgia, into its namesake that it pretty much resides mostly today in Kentucky, brandy was used majority in the consumption of the drink. And I think David does a phenomenal job outlining that in Imbibe, right? So when we look at the brandy julep, and we can move to the next slide, like I said, today, if you say julep, most people are going to think of bourbon, right? If you wanted to use whiskey and bourbon in a julep, you had to specifically call for it. And it wasn't really known as a mint julep. You'd have to say, I would like a whiskey julep. If you would call for a mint julep, you would most likely get brandy as part of that. Now, whiskey was easily sourced. You can get rye whiskey predominantly in the area. I live in Pennsylvania, so there was a lot of rye. So in commonplace, if you couldn't have access to brandy or some type of brandy, you could easily access whiskey. But there's a quote that was commonly used back then, was like, a properly made julep was made with brandy, right? So if we move on to the next slide, you'll kind of see here that, there was something known as a prescription julep. And this prescription julep used brandy as its base. It maintained that. However, it would get a float of rum, specifically Jamaican rum was used on a regular basis, and or sometimes that whiskey if made available. And this was the norm, this was the norm moving up into about the Civil War. And this goes into our next slide where, in this time period, the brandy julep and even punch were at the peak of their popularity. The julep was a favorite within the military, one, because of its medicinal properties. I mean, you could find mint growing anywhere, so you can easily blend it with your brandy. I'm sure if you had an injury, they would probably give you some type of drink to consume to kind of woe your ails in some way, shape, or form. But as we transitioned as a nation after the Civil War, we also begin to see a transition with the julep, right? And as we move into the next slide, we start to see that ice is more available at this time, right? In 1869, the Julep Strainer, the straw of its time, was created. And when the Julep Strainer was added to the julep, this kind of exploded the popularity of the mint julep. I don't think people had the best dental practice back then, and holding back that ice was kind of essential in making sure that this drink was extremely popular and could explode during this time. However, it was 1874 specifically where things started to happen, right? There's two publications that arose, the American Bartender and the Art and Mystery of Mixing Drinks, and they specifically called for whiskey being used in the julep. And also we're seeing the Kentucky Derby come into play. And when the Kentucky Derby came into play, obviously outdoor event, juleps were being consumed. But at that time, people were calling for old bourbon, obviously in Kentucky, to be used in their juleps. And at first, this wasn't regularly accepted. There was a little pushback. However, I think David says it beautifully on page 193 in Imbibe. There's a nice little quote I like saying that at this time, the whiskey-fueled julep comfortably wore the mantle the Brandy Julep had earned. It became the king of summer drinks. So at this time, we start to see brandy fall into the wayside of the julep and kind of whiskey and bourbon take hold. So with that, we'll go into the next slide and we'll see the lineage of where that julep was. I just like the julep story because I think it's a beautiful one. If you have never had the opportunity to make a brandy julep, I highly recommend it. You can't deny the julep's importance when it comes to American drinking culture. You know, it has this brandy roots that are worth the re-exploration, right? But the julep also spawned the brandy smash. And then because of that mint flavor, you'll see when we get further up that timeline, it truly inspired the stinger once, you know, creme de menthe started to come into play. So a little long-winded on the julep, but a story worth telling. Again, if you had a chance to make a brandy julep, please do. But we'll move along and we'll move on to the next slide and kind of do a little bit of a time loop, right? If you attended and had the opportunity to view Scott and Eric's previous presentation, I think they did a beautiful job talking about the difference between cognac and California brandy. You know, even though they are directionally different in how they are produced, essentially at their core, they're just masterfully like produce brandies, right? And I think this kind of mirrors what we're going to talk about at that dotted line I previously mentioned between the brandy punch and the brandy cocktail. Two essentially different directions on the cocktail evolutionary map, extremely important, but they're going to circle back to probably the most influential section of this entire map. So with that said, let's talk about the brandy cocktail first, right? The brandy cocktail, essentially brandy, curacao, sugar, and bitters at its mixture. It is a linchpin, and you'll see it here, to an entire island of libations on this chart. You know, whether they be direct descendants or just drinks that are inspired on this evolutionary chain, you know, it's extremely important to the map that is produced here. You know, and as the brandy cocktail kind of expands itself across the country and the idea of the cocktail starts to take hold, right? What else is happening at this time? And again, we'll revisit what Eric and Scott kind of discussed before. What's happening in California, right? So California is moving past war. It's finding its path as a state. Rum and whiskey are kind of declining as the American spirit preference, and brandy starts to take hold, and they outline it beautifully here on this slide. And that's specifically in this 1850 to 1855 time period. Now, even though this is what's going on in California, there's something extremely important happening at the same time for brandy, and that is in New Orleans. So we are going to move quickly over to our next slide in New Orleans. And now we're in like the Baroque age of American mixology, right? And this makes total sense because we're in such a French-inspired city. And when we talk about France, brandy's essentially at the core of the heart of what they think over in France. However, as a French-inspired city, why not it be at the heart of their beverage culture? So you can see here some of the influence that New Orleans had on brandy cocktails. We can start here for where the brandy cocktail kind of helped, you know, influence along the way to get us to the point of like coffee drinks, right? And chicory being an important part, and the Café Brûlot, you know, taking hold as one of the early coffee cocktails, eventually getting us to the Brandy Blazer. Side note, you know, as bartenders, and if you've been to Tales, if you've been to the Aaron Rose, like I'm sure many of you have, ask them what one of the spirits is in that beautiful cocktail. You might be surprised to find out what it is. However, I'm going to move along real quick and not get stuck on that point. I do have one drink on here that I specifically put on and David didn't have on, and I feel like it's important to discuss, and that's this cocktail highlighted here in this darker brown color, and that's the Sazerac. The Sazerac we all know as kind of like a rye whiskey rendition of a cocktail. However, there is evidence that Sazerac des Forges Afi, I think that's the pronunciation. I'm not that great at French. Cognac was used in the original creation of the cocktail. There is a little bit of evidence that Peychaud's even supports this. So even though David doesn't have it on the map, it is worth exploring whether or not brandy has a core sense of this drink. And having a drink so important to New Orleans, I think is, again, from a brandy aspect, it's worth exploring. However, in my opinion, the most important cocktail to come out of New Orleans is the one that's highlighted here in red, and that's the Crusta. And why is the Crusta important? Well, one, it's in direct lineage from the Brandy Cocktail. However, it is the one drink that draws a connectoral line between the two major islands of cocktails on this evolutionary chain, right? And it creates the sours category. And this gets into our next slide. And, you know, I don't think we need to talk about how important the sours category is to cocktails. I mean, we got the daiquiri, the daisy, the whiskey sour. I mean, the list goes on, the bee's knees, we can get into it, right? However, from a brandy sense, you know, brandy punch originally gives us to the point of where we can get to the brandy sours, right? And the brandy sours and fix kind of is the guiding light to get us to the French 75. You know, punch essentially being at its core just spirit, sugar, and citrus. You know, you have all the ingredients there for the sours, and that conceptual base kind of gives you that lineage that you need to go in one direction. However, the cocktail and the Crusta, you know, the Crusta is a fancy cocktail, and so even the daisy actually brings modifiers into the mix, right? And, you know, when you bring modifiers into the mix, that's where we get to the sidecar. And the Crusta to the sidecar is this linchpin that gets us to America's #1 selling cocktail, and that's the Margarita. And why am I talking about the Margarita, right? And I have it highlighted here in green. Well, brandy has an important role with the Margarita, whether you want to think it or not. You know, I think when you think about the orange component and that orange liqueur regularly used in the cocktail, you know, David did a phenomenal job with Pierre Ferrand to make dry curacao, right? And what's the base to dry curacao? It is brandy, right? Many people would make a Cadillac margarita using Grand Marnier. What is the base to Grand Marnier? It's brandy. If we want to talk about national accounts, right? Let's talk about Chili's, right? Chili's #1 selling margarita on the menu is the El Presidente. What is at the base of the El Presidente but a Mexican brandy? Interesting fact, they actually use E&J brandy now, but the core of that is brandy. So brandy did play an important role and still plays an important role within that margarita space today. Again, we can't deny the importance of that sours category, and you know, there's a connectoral line and ways that we can dive into, you know, the minutia of everything we can get here. And I don't want to dive too much into it. You might see highlighted here in small gray is the Pisco Sour. Obviously, wouldn't want to add it in there, but again, this guy's always 100 years late. I love Pisco to death, but you know, let's start reevaluating ourselves a little bit more. Make some more Pisco cocktails, guys. We got to get it going. So with that said, I don't want to take too much time, and we want to move up this chart pretty quickly. So we're going to also revisit something that Eric discussed beautifully in his last class. And since we discussed these two islands, let's do a time loop real quick and jump into the Brandy Train, right? The importance of the Transcontinental Railroad is undeniable. I mean, it opened the door to America. It's the deployment of citrus in parts of the country that didn't have access to citrus, right? So now more and more people are starting to make cocktails they heard of, but didn't have access to do on a regular basis. And you're also exposing the country to some unique flavors, right? And because of this, there's one specific cocktail I want to point out on this evolutionary chain, and that gets into our next slide, and that is the Japanese cocktail. And I want to point out the Japanese cocktail specifically because, again, we're getting into a culinary aspect of things. We're bringing in a French culinary ingredient, orgeat, right? Commonly associated with tiki drinks. However, a little history on orgeat is that, you know, originally it was an 18th century kind of barley focused ingredient. They did add almond because barley didn't have that much flavor. So almond was added to kind of enhance the flavor. And eventually it was turned into a cordial. And the first spirits being added were brandy and rum. Right. So with the Japanese cocktail, you know, this combination of brandy and orgeat, it created like an entirely new consumption experience during this time. Right. It didn't mask the flavor of brandy, but enhanced it. And that's a beautiful thing, right? Fast forward to today, and that's why I like to showcase here, as a bartending community, we are re-examining orgeat as an ingredient. And what can we do? Does it need to be almonds? No. I highly encourage looking at California ingredients. Look at sunflower seeds, walnuts, pistachios, pumpkin seeds, because we're in the season of that. Avocado seeds. There are so many beautiful things that you can do in the creation orgeat. However, also look past that neutral grain spirit as the addition into the cordial being created. Look at brandy again. It enhances the flavor. It makes something truly unique. So enough of the Japanese. We'll move around a little bit further. We're kind of rounding the corner here, right? I know we're tight on time of the evolutionary chart, and we're going to jump again through another time loop, right? And let's jump into like the brink of the 20th century, and something important is going to happen here. And Eric did a great job outlining this before. California brandy production is exploding during this time. I mean, this slide outlines it. You go from 600,000 gallons being produced to almost 2 million gallons, not only spreading itself across the US, but it's also spreading overseas. So California brandy is now more readily available than any other time, right? This is kind of like that golden age that they discussed of brandy, specifically California brandy, right? And this is also the same time period that we're really starting to see the artistry of bartending coming to age, right? And as we move into the next slide, we start to see, this is the classic, the gilded age of the American cocktail. Jerry Thomas is slinging some Brandy Juleps, punches are still in fashion. And California brandy is more readily available now than it ever has been before. So when I look at this chart and I start seeing that, bartenders are now exploring renditions of the Manhattan, right? That traditionally is made with whiskey and bourbon, but now throwing brandy into the mix, making the Harvard and the Metropolitan, the brandy old fashioned comes into play. We can talk about the Wisconsin brandy old fashioned, the Stinger. This is where the Stinger starts to show up. You start to see that brandy's, pushing, it's getting there. It's making its way into cocktail culture on a regular basis. However, this is also the same time frame where, give it a couple years and something drastic happens, and that is Prohibition, right? And this is the national hiccup that kind of disrupted all of bartending and cocktail creation here in the US. Some bartenders did move into the speakeasies, kind of had their hands tied on ingredients and what they could do on a quick, fast basis. But some bartenders moved overseas, right? They wanted to continue the craft. And this is where we're going to kind of do a little bit of a time loop again. We'll revisit sours, but I think it's important to kind of give credit where credit's due. And that's on our next slide, and point out specifically the French 75, the sidecar, and between the sheets. These are purely French creations. We can kind of argue about the history of them. It's most believed that these were created obviously in Paris at Harry's New York bar. But we see documentation of these drinks in the 1922 book, Harry's ABC of Mixing Cocktails. So although not American creations, extremely important when we talk about the getting brandy cocktails to where we need to get to moving forward during this time of Prohibition. So Prohibition ends, and then you start to see a drastic change in spirit preferences. You get, the vodka cocktail consumption is on the rise. However, brandy, specifically California brandy consumption, is also increasing. However, we're getting into brandy being pocketed into an after dinner drink, a dessert cocktail. People are only looking at it seasonally, whether it be a fall or winter libation, still used in punch at times, or even regionalized, like the Wisconsin old fashioned I mentioned before. However, that gets me into the point I really want to make, and I think we should all discuss, and that's on the next one. And that is, we discussed the golden age of California brandy, but I think now we need to examine the golden age of California brandy cocktails. And I think that's the important role we play now, is that we're all rediscovering the spirit. I think there's a huge place for it to play in cocktails. And, Scott did a wonderful job on the last presentation of showcasing kind of the extremity of flavors that you can find on the next slide. And within a beautiful premium California brandy. I mean, when you're exploring the capabilities of a premium California brandy and this spirit so rich in flavor, it offers us as bartenders a unique opportunity to just think outside the box, right? So working for E&J Gallo Winery, we have a fantastic portfolio of wines, but many people don't know the fantastic portfolio of spirits that we have. In addition to that, we have an arsenal of some unbelievable ambassadors across the entire country that represent these spirits. And over the years, we've all done a collective job of just trying to include brandy and rethink brandy in ways that most people haven't done before. Working with Tad Carducci and thinking, let's make the new old fashioned of just 2 ingredients. Let's use Amaro Montenegro and California Brandy as just kind of like that blend, right? Speaking of Montenegro, can a Brandy Alexander be upgraded, right? Can you use a good California Brandy? Kudos to Tempest Fugit for making an unbelievable chocolate liqueur. However, add a little bit of Montenegro in that and start looking at ingredients like oat milk and things that are a little bit more modern to kind of reinvent things that we know of the past, right? Equal part cocktails are phenomenal in this aspect, right? The Bouvardier made with brandy in either Select or Lufis is unbelievable. A paper plane with brandy is flat out delicious, right? And as a winery, I've explored lately, and I don't believe I'm the only one, the idea of using wine syrups, right? Wine syrups is in addition to taking out the sodas and things like that and adding sparklings into classic cocktails. What a wonderful complement of flavors. It's like the grape working from A to Z in a cocktail. I mean, there's so many wonderful things that you can do in reinventing some classics using wine syrups. And mentioned before, the tropical realm, right? The Mai Tai, the Pina Colada, the daiquiri, the Jungle Bird, made with brandy, beautiful drinks, right? So when you get into our Scotch portfolio, which we've done with 50-50 split bases on things like the Rob Roy, there's so many things that you can do. And last, I never want to say sub out whiskey all the time. However, if you want to begin and you're early in your stages of bartending and start examining what can I really do with a brandy, a sub out in things like a Brown Derby, a Gold Rush. When we talk about Scotch, something like a penicillin, brandy can do some wonderful things there. And it would open your eyes to what we want to do. So I think the final thing I want to do is just put the challenge, right? I challenge all of you to re-examine not only brandy, but what it can do, right? Don't think of it as a fall or winter ingredient. It can work beautifully in spring, in summer, any way that you want. But it takes us as a collective now to kind of move this evolutionary chart forward and create the modern classics that people are going to make, 100 years from now. And hopefully there's another human being sitting in my space 100 years from now talking about brandy cocktails and what we're doing today. So that's all I have. I think I hit it right on the dot of 3 o'clock my time. So from there, I think, Brittany, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Well, that was a wealth of information. I just did not say a word because I was like, I know how much is in here to get through, and I want to make sure that everybody gets all of the information. But we did have a couple of questions come in. Before I get to those, I did want to basically rewind the presentation to where I got to see your enthusiasm for milk punch by you slamming the table. And that is the kind of energy I'm trying to have in my life, especially when it comes to milk punches. They're delicious. So I appreciate that we both share an enthusiasm about a milk punch. I saw you do it and I was like, yes, milk punches make me feel that way too. But as for our questions, we only had 2 come in. We may have some more come in before we finally log off of here, but I'm sure there are many people who are just like processing right now because we got so much info. The first one, we've been talking a lot about brandy cocktails. So what is your desert island
I think I
brandy
said it
cocktail?
enough. I will never deny a mint julep for the fact of its simplicity. Aesthetically, it's gorgeous. However, I have to make sure that I have ice on this desert island. So if you can confirm that, and if you can confirm I can grow my own mint, I'll be fine.
Well, I think this desert island is like whatever we want it to be. So I'm going to say it has ice and mint on it. And I do appreciate that choice, not only because you're right, delicious cocktail, but you don't have to worry about that cup breaking. You know what I mean? Like you don't have like a big like hurricane glass or something like that. That like if it gets broken, you're just gonna have a handful of ice.
If you are trapped on a desert island, and I do this discussion a lot because we have Rum Haven coconut rum liqueur in our portfolio. I believe coconut's like the new vanilla. It's fantastic, right? If I have a coconut cup and I can add the beauty of coconut into the mix, I'm all for having coconut juleps made with brandy on a desert island every day. The process of going through making it, the aesthetic when it's all said and done, and it's just really cold and refreshing, that I'll take it any day of the week.
10 out of 10 would drink. That sounds delicious. I personally love coconut. It's one of my favorite things in the whole world. So I think now I have some experimenting to do for this coconut mint julep situation, but I'll report back my findings because, you know, I really like to quality check things. It's really important to form a reliable and scientific driven opinion on things. So I plan on testing that out fully, and I'll let everyone know how it goes. Our second question, I think this is such a good question because all of this info is so rooted in writing. So other than imbibe and bitters, what are like some books that you're like, y'all really need to get this book? It's really, really good, and you're going to learn a lot from it, and you're going to reference it like again and again. It can be one or like
so
20,
that's a loaded question, right? So I think it comes down to what's your goal, right? So that, you know, if you think about our bartending mentors of like the books that Death & Co wrote or things that Meehan's doing. There's a phenomenal array of books. And I think right now that everyone's trapped in their home, we're going to see an explosion of books happen in time. I'm a history buff. So, you know, I know David, I always refer back to because I know it's factual and I know the research has been done. You know, I'm not big on too many romanticized stories. I like the facts that I know I can work off of. Dale's books, and I know that he just re-released his second rendition, like they are phenomenal as well. Again, I think it just goes into what are you looking for? You know, when you start looking at like the PDX or PDT book and what Death & Co did, I think they do a beautiful job outlining like the construction of bars, the conceptual idea of building cocktails, et cetera, et cetera. However, if you're looking for history, any book that David writes, I'm kind of all for like, let's get into it. And that bitters book, to understand bitters, is just a huge kind of eye-opening aspect of things.
Well, you heard it here. Go by what you're looking to learn. And there's probably a book written by somebody who's really awesome that can help you along the way. And while we were discussing books, I had like this question and I was like, it's my question, so I'm going to hold it till the end. We had like 3 questions come in from our viewers. So we're going to prioritize those. If we have time for my silly question, then we'll get to the silly question. If not, okay. I will hit you in the DMs to ask you a silly question.
I think all chapters, come on.
So for the wine syrup that you mentioned, do you reduce the wine down and just add sugar, or like what's the process there like?
Yeah, so one, you know, enjoy your wine, but if by any chance a bottle was not completely consumed that evening and you have some left over to the next day, I don't like saying reduce in half, right? I like bringing it to a low simmer, adding equal parts of sugar to the liquid, and waiting for the sugar to dissolve and allowing that to cool. One, you got a viscosity that's easy to pour, right? You don't want this caramelized, overburnt kind of flavor. You want to keep the freshness, as much of the fresh flavor of the wine that can be in play. However, you know, don't negate sparkling wine syrups either. We have La Marca Prosecco, and I make Prosecco syrup all the time. When it loses its bubbles, it's not dead. Right. And the beautiful things that you can do with like Sauvignon Blanc with gin and a Collins, or even with brandy and a Collins, or, you know, using rosé with aperitivos and again, using that sparkling component in addition with like things like soda and tonic and like basic G&Ts or brandy French 75s. There's just a lot of things you can do. So I wouldn't say like, you know, bring it to a hard boil. You want to maintain those rich flavors the wine has, but again, just equal parts sugar and water. Just keep it simple, right? We can get into the minutia of what we would do as bartenders, but there's a greater whole here, and we have to keep it simplified for everyone watching. And wine syrup is a topic all on its own. So
maybe we'll have to have another class about wine syrups.
Happy to lead that.
We'll see what we can arrange for wine syrup, so we can just like really, maybe we can have a fun tree like we did for these brandy cocktails. Who knows? But we'll keep you up to date on all of our wine syrup class related plans. But I think this question's really fun because it could literally be anything. For you personally, what is your favorite like ingredient to incorporate into a brandy cocktail that like when someone tastes it, they're like, I would have never thought to put this in a brandy cocktail? Like, what's your like, oh, I'm really about to surprise these people right now. Like, what's that for you?
So that's an interesting question. So I have a separate project I work on, which is the Indigenous Project, where I focus solely on ingredients indigenous to this hemisphere, right? And how Native communities use them. And we can get into a whole slew of ingredients that are unique. I happen to live in the Susquehannock Valley of Pennsylvania, where the Susquehannock Indians used to be, where pawpaw is regularly available. And pawpaw as an ingredient is just delicious with brandy. In addition to that, because I kind of mentioned earlier that use of brandy almost as like a whiskey substitute for those that are just beginning on thinking about using brandy in cocktails, I love corn syrup. Right, so taking fresh corn and making syrups out of that, and you almost get that resemblance of when you use brandy. If you use a little bit of corn syrup, you start to have this kind of flavor reminder, almost like a whisper of like a bourbon or a whiskey being in the cocktail. I think there's that new corn liqueur, Nixta, I believe it's called. Again, it's utilizing corn as an ingredient itself. And when I mean corn syrup, I don't mean your basic corn syrup that you get at the store. I mean, go out, buy corn, like blend it down, add your sugar and water, and like actually make syrup out of corn. And it's quite delicious. And there's tons of corns where you talk about black corn, rainbow corn. I mean, let's get into the minutiae of corn if you want. I can talk for days on that.
That's another class. I am really excited that you said that because I really enjoy corn in a cocktail. Like that is some stuff that like I see that on a menu and I'm like, oh, thank you. This is going to be so delicious. And I don't know. I just love to see things that you're like, I didn't expect this to be in here, but I know it's going to be good. So I'm ordering this immediately. And, I appreciate that we share a passion for milk punches and corn. So our friendship is off to a fantastic start, Chris.
You got it.
We have more questions.
Okay, let's keep going.
So this one, I think we can kind of like combine these two. They're definitely very different questions, but I think it can kind of be a part A, part B situation. So someone wants to know, they want to add California Brandy to their menu, but they are a little unsure of exactly how to list it on the menu. Do you have any recommendations for like highlighting the products to guests through your menu, or like things to say or not say to make sure that people see it and they're like, oh, like this sounds really great? Because, sometimes we can write things down and then folks who maybe don't work behind the bar look at them and they're like, this is scary in a lot of words. I don't know.
So this is the issue we run into, right? Is that brandy has not existed on these menus for such a long time that there's a lack of consumer awareness. And this is why discussions like this are important, right? It's up to us to propel not only from an educational standpoint, but the idea of brandy being used in cocktails. So my suggestion is, one, you need to take ownership to the drink that you put on the menu. And so does your staff. And I think right now the service staff is more important than ever because many people can't sit at a bar. So as a bartender, your job is to educate the people around you. So if you want to propel a brandy cocktail on the menu, one, just mention the brandy by name that's being used, right? But it's up to us to kind of educate the consumer on, hey, you should really try this out. It's kind of unique. It utilizes California brandy. Most times you say brandy, people think after dinner drink, fall, winter. However, let's talk about what we sent out to the group. Let's make a daiquiri using chamomile and bring it into that kind of spring idea, right? I don't think there's again, I think it's a little bit of a loaded question. There's not a simple answer to this. It comes down to us taking ownership and being advocates for the category and the drinks that we create and put on menus.
I love that. And I know, like, obviously when you're creating a menu, like it's a range, right? Like not every drink on a menu is your favorite drink because you're making drinks for your guests. Like you're not making them for yourself. But I always found like I was the most excited about recommending the one that like I liked the best. So like grab you some Argonaut and Germain-Robin, experiment, make your favorite cocktail, and then put on that menu. You'll be very excited to tell people all about it.
In addition, I think it gives us an opportunity to communicate, right? It's not take an order and go away. It gives us a story to tell. It gives us a why, and it gives us just a way to communicate with our guests. And I think, we all forget that hospitality is the accommodation to our guests. And if we treat them as, here's your stuff, I'm walking away, you're losing that sense of hospitality. And I think, again, now more than ever, whether we do it with our eyes, with a mask on, we need to build back this sense of hospitality and taking that relationship that is so desperately needed to where it should be in the fact of communication. I
co-sign that statement. But we have 2 more questions plus my silly question. We're getting it in there. The next one's also menu related. So someone wrote in and said that they're working on their like winter menu now. Do you have any like directional recommendations for like things that would be really delicious for a winter brandy cocktail, which I feel like you're going to have a lot of recommendations because there's so much focus on brandy in the winter time.
Yeah, I mean, listen, again, there's a lot of education to get people to think of brandy in a unique way. But if you want to relate to the customers, like find the things that they know and love, right? I defy you to tell me that a brandy Alexander is not delicious.
I would never do that because that would be a lie.
Right? It would be a lie. However, let's reinvent the ingredients. That's why I mentioned earlier, use oat milk. Use those things that are kind of like the trigger items to get consumers to say, oh, wow, that sounds interesting enough. I want to try it. Yeah, it's a Brandy Alexander. I know it. I've heard of it. I'm not scared of it. But reinvent how you build it and reinvent how a consumer sees it. Eggnogs as well. We're moving into eggnog season. I'm making eggnogs next week. They're delicious, right? Okay. So like again, just do what's consumer friendly, but rebuild it with your footprint, like your little fingerprint, however you want to put your stamp on it, but just rethink the other ingredients. Just know that when you use a premium California brandy, you can have faith that you're using a spirit of high quality. And I'm telling you, Argonaut, if you're in California, is a phenomenal ingredient. And if you want to indulge yourself and bring up the pour cost just a little bit, I would say Germain-Robin is always an option as well, right? So,
and I mean, California, growing all of the beautiful things all of the time. So I'm sure I haven't personally researched it, but I can and will probably after this because I'll just want to know. I'm sure that there's so many things, right, that are the fall, winter fruits and vegetables from California that would naturally complement California brandy in a cocktail because they're from the same place. So that's always a good place to start. This next one is like
California has its own microclimate. That thing's like spring, summer, year round. It's not fair.
I know. Today it's very rainy here in Alabama, but it's okay because we were talking about how I'm moving to the California Brandy house. So soon I will never see this again.
It's rainy here in Pennsylvania too, but I also had the opportunity to pick up some apple cider today.
Oh, nice.
So unfiltered apple cider with some California brandy, add in a little bit of Montenegro Amaro. I think I'm good to go. So
I love that. I can't wait to move to my new home, the California Brandy house, and make sure that that's on the menu every day. So the next question I have, the question itself is a little bit long, so I'm just gonna go for it. So when we like Pisco Sour, someone says that to you and you're immediately like, I know what that is. It's very recognizable. Are there any other like cocktails that kind of feature, that are well known that feature like a brandy of the world? So like something that like an Eastern European brandy, like it's the this and this, or a Georgian brandy? Like, do those have any of their own cocktails that you know of that are as recognizable as when someone says Pisco Sour to you?
Yeah, so I mean, like Applejack has its own thing, but that's still U.S. And even though the Pisco Sour is essentially kind of American, even though it's Peruvian. I mean, the Pisco Punch is more American than Peruvian because it has that San Francisco base. This might be a fantastic question for Effie, and I always forget how to pronounce her last name, but she used to represent Metaxa, right? And that's that Greek brandy. And I feel like in that portion of the world, there might be a few cocktails that wouldn't come to my mind, but might be so associated with that Greek brandy that it's like, how do you not know?
Absolutely.
Right? And I think the other ones are like, listen, Cognac's still a brandy, right? And we talked about the French 75 and the sidecar and being such an influence and French in its idea. Those are the ones that really pop out. Again, my focus has been more on this side of the hemisphere. So European influence, I know somewhat, but I wouldn't be able to kind of deep dive too much and give you exact examples, right?
Okay. Well, whoever asked that question, if you get to the bottom of this, let us know. Maybe we'll have you on.
That's a David Wandrich question. That is a Wandrich question, right? My job today was just be a tour guide, like I said. Like Wandrich is the guy that's going to get into the minutia of detail on things like that. And I will never claim to be a cocktail historian. However, I will claim to be someone that really does search for facts in what I find. So we can go from there.
So this is the last question. It's my silly question. So all pressure is off. You said you're a history buff. I also am. So if you had to pick between two, the History Channel has called you. You're going to be on the History Channel, but you have to pick between two shows. Are you going like more the American Pickers route, or are you going Ancient Aliens?
American Pickers.
See, I'm an Ancient Aliens gal. I just love the like out there theory.
I love the ancient astronaut theory. I feel like there's something to that story. However, the grasping and finding of something that's so tangibly real and bringing it back to life, whether through story or physically offering it to somebody, to me, is kind of ingrained into my DNA. And like I mentioned earlier, my side project of the Indigenous Project, I think, that's part of why I wanted to do it, was to kind of tell these beautiful stories that, the ingredients that this hemisphere have to offer, right? So I think, as nerdy as that question is, I would have to go American Pickers because there's something tangible there. There's something that we can kind of share as an existence between two human beings that actually found something, right?
Well, I love that answer. And for any of you watching, you can find me on Ancient Aliens, and you can find Chris on American Pickers soon, because I'm sure the History Channel is going to see this and be very excited to have us both. But right now, it's time for thank yous and waves goodbye and all of those sad things that we have to do when classes end. But unfortunately, we can't be on the internet forever. It's just not how it works. So I'm gonna blaze through the list of all of the things that we need to discuss before we get out of here. First of all, thank you so much to Chris, Eric, Scott, J.A., Linda. Linda had to hop off because she has to work. But thank you so much for spending time with us today, for being here, for telling us all we need to know about brandy-related life. Once again, if you have not seen Scott and Eric's California Brandy Rediscovering California's Native Spirit, there we go. You can catch it on this page anytime you want to, because it just lives there now. And this class will also just live there now as soon as this is over. For any other classes that you might want to see, you can just hit that follow button on the Portland Cocktail Week Facebook page. You can also catch us on YouTube. I know some people are not Facebookers. I totally get it, but it's okay because we have a YouTube channel for that. And we simulcast the classes live, so you don't even have to wait till they're over to catch them there. You can follow us on Instagram. we usually post what we're about to do there, and usually a little recap of what we just did. So if you're interested in knowing what's about to happen or catching up on what just happened, you can check us out over there. You can also follow these lovely humans on the screen with me on Instagram. Check out what they are up to. I know we've got Chris at Elixir Craft Cocktails. You can catch Scott at Argonaut Scott. J.A., yours is J.A. Harrison?
It used to be until an incident in Mexico City caused me to lose access to that account. So it is now at Cloud-Monger.
There we go, at Cloud-Monger. You can catch up with J.A. and see what's going on there. Always beautiful cocktails coming out of J.A. as a human person, so check those out. And Eric is probably smarter than all of us and doesn't do the social media, but you can keep up with Germain-Robin at Germain-Robin's Instagram, which is just at Germain-Robin. And Eric has been nice enough to share his email address, so you can ask him questions about Germain-Robin or California Brandy House. So you can do that at eric@germain-robin.com. I think that is everyone's social media information. Yeah, this was super fun. It has been such a pleasure to work with you all and to learn so much from all of you. And hopefully we will see you on this channel, all of you, again in the future. But in the meantime, you can tune back in on Friday because we've got some more fun frozen beverage stuff for all of you. And with that, y'all have a good Wednesday.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, y'all.
Have a good one.